The jeweler had laid out 3 rings on black velvet, and Joon-woo had already made his choice before the man finished his pitch. A princess-cut diamond, clean lines, nothing showy, the kind of ring that said this was decided with calculator, not a heart, which was, more or less, accurate. "Excellent choice," the jeweler said, already reaching for box. "The Beck family will be pleased." Joon-woo didn't answer. He rarely did, when there was nothing worth saying. At 36, he had built a reputation inside the Cheonji conglomerate for silences that made board members reread their own proposals twice before speaking again. The silence wasn't performance. It was simply what was left of him after a childhood spent learning that words, once spoken, could be used against you by people who loved you. The ring went into its box. The box went into his coat pocket. In 11 days, it would end a truce negotiation disguised as a marriage, his marriage, to a woman he'd met 4 times, each meeting shorter and more procedural than the last. He stepped out of the shop onto the street in Itaewon, his bodyguard CO Mingyu 2 paces behind him, already scanning the crowd out of habit rather than necessity. The evening had that particular gold light Seoul got in early autumn, spilling out of restaurant windows and catching on wet pavement from an earlier rain. That was when he saw her. She was crouched at the base of a lamppost, adjusting the strap on a small boy's backpack, laughing at something the boy had said. A real laugh, unguarded, her whole face open with it. Her locks were pulled back loosely, a few strands escaping to catch the light. Joon-woo felt the ground shift under him in a way it had not shifted in 7 years. "Amara," he said, before he decided to say anything at all. Mingyu, walking behind him, stopped mid-step and followed his employer's gaze. Then he went very quiet, the particular quiet of a man recalculating an entire evening's plans. The woman straightened, took the boy's hand, and began walking. The boy, maybe 6, maybe 7, turned his head to glance back at a food cart they were passing, and for 1 full second Joon-woo saw his own face looking back at him from 30 years in the past. Not a resemblance, not similar features. The exact set of the eyes, narrow and serious. The same expression his grandmother used to call the boy as doing math nobody assigned him. The ring box slipped out of Joon-woo's fingers and hit the pavement with a soft, absurd thud. "Sir." Mingyu was already crouching to retrieve it. "Sir, are you?" Joon-woo was already walking. To understand what cracked open on that sidewalk, you have to go back 8 years, to a version of Joon-woo, who did not yet know how to make a room go silent by walking into it. He was 28 then, 3 years into carrying the weight of an empire his father had built out of container shipping, real estate development, and a lending arm that operated in a specific gray area between aggressive and illegal. The Cheonji group looked, from the outside, like any ambitious mid-tier conglomerate. It was only from inside that you understood some of the shipping containers moved things that weren't on the manifest, and some of the loans were collected by men who did not carry briefcases. Joon-woo had absorbed his father's lessons the way other sons absorbed how to throw a baseball. Trust is a door. Once it's open, anyone can walk through it, including the people who mean to hurt you. Keep the door shut. He had built a life around that lesson. Controlled, efficient, essentially friendless, right up until he met a woman who had never once, in her entire life, been intimidated by him. Amara Whitfield was 25, born in Houston to a father from Lagos and a mother from Georgia, and she'd come to Seoul on a 2-year fellowship studying Hanji papermaking under a master who accepted, on average, 1 apprentice per decade. She ran a tiny workshop near Ixindong, restoring damaged historical documents and teaching papermaking workshops to tourists who mostly wanted a nice afternoon and left, occasionally, with something like real skill. They met because Cheonji's Cultural Foundation, the legitimate, photogenic arm of the company that funded museum exhibits and made for good press, had commissioned restoration work for an archive project, and Amara's studio had been brought on as a subcontractor. Joon-woo almost never attended vendor meetings personally. He came to this one because the foundation's director had the flu, and somebody needed to sign off on the timeline before a gala deadline collapsed. He walked into a workshop that smelled like rice starch and old paper and found a woman on her knees on the floor, arguing with a supplier's rep about a shipment of mulberry bark that had arrived improperly dried. "This isn't ready," she was saying, holding a sheet up to the light. "You can see the fiber's still too coarse. It'll tear the second I try to layer it." The supplier's rep looked like a man who deeply regretted several of his recent life choices. Joon-woo, standing in the doorway in a suit that cost more than the man's monthly salary, said nothing for a long moment. Then, she's right, look at the grain. Amara turned, looked him up and down with an expression that contained 0% of the deference he was used to receiving from literally everyone, and said, "Oh, we've got an expert." "I'm the client," he said. "Well, the client's got a good eye," she said, standing and wiping her hands on her apron. "Tell that to your supplier." He did that afternoon, in a phone call that ended with the supplier offering a full replacement shipment and a personal apology that bordered on tearful. Amara found out 3 days later, when the corrected materials arrived along with a story from the delivery driver about how some scary rich guy had apparently terrified an entire supply company over one bad batch of bark. She showed up at Cheonji Tower to thank him, which, as his assistant informed him afterward in a tone of genuine astonishment, no one ever did, and walked past 2 receptionists who tried and failed to stop her. "You didn't have to do that," she said, standing in his office, which was approximately the size of her entire apartment. "You were right," he said. "I don't like paying for wrong. Most powerful men I've met don't care about being right. They care about being obeyed." "I'm not most men," he said. "We'll see," she said, and left. It took him 4 months to admit, even privately, that he'd started finding reasons to route his car past her workshop on the way to meetings that didn't require the detour. It took her 4 months to admit she'd started keeping a second mug behind the counter, just in case. What Amara noticed about him, in those early months, was that he actually listened, retained things, followed up on them without being asked. He remembered she hated cilantro, that her favorite color to work with was a very specific shade of indigo, that she called her younger sister every single Sunday at 9 a.m. Houston time, and would take no meetings during that hour, no matter who was asking. He never once made her feel small for not bowing correctly, for laughing too loud in rooms full of quiet men, for being the only black woman in most spaces she and Joon-woo occupied together. What Joon-woo noticed about Amara was that she was the only person in his adult life who had never once asked him for anything. Not money, not protection, not a favor routed quietly through the right channel. She argued with him about paper grain, and whether Houston barbecue was superior to Korean barbecue. She was correct. He would not admit it, and had, for a genuinely long time, no real understanding of what his family's business actually was. He fell for her before he understood what was happening. By the time he understood, it was too late to want to stop it. There was no formal proposal. There was a Tuesday evening, 10 months in, when he sat on the floor of her workshop while she trimmed a sheet of paper with a bone folder and said, without any of the control he used in every other sentence of his life, "I don't know how to do this. I've never wanted before." She set the folder down. "You're doing fine," she said. "You're already doing it." His mother, Yoon So-yeon, found out 3 weeks later. Her reaction was exactly what Joon-woo had feared. She didn't raise her voice. She never did. She asked one question, in a tone so level it could have cut glass. "Does she know what we are?" "No," Joon-woo admitted. "Then she doesn't know what she's agreeing to." His uncle, Han Tae-sik, his father's younger brother, and the man his father trusted with operational details even Joon-woo wasn't fully briefed on, took a different approach. He smiled, clapped Joon-woo on the shoulder, and said, "Enjoy her, nephew. Just don't be stupid about it." Joon-woo should have heard the warning folded inside that sentence. He didn't. He was too busy, for the first time in his adult life, being happy. For nearly a year, Han Joon-woo lived something close to an ordinary life. He learned to sit on the floor of a workshop without complaining about his knees. He learned that Amara hummed off-key while she worked, old gospel songs tangled up with whatever was on the radio. He learned the exact weight of her hand in his during the rare evenings when no one from either of their worlds was watching. She learned that he flinched, faintly, at sudden loud noises, a habit from a childhood he never fully explained. She learned that when he was under real stress, the kind he never let show on his face, his thumb moved in slow, unconscious circles against the inside of his opposite wrist, like he was checking for a pulse that might have stopped. She learned to read that motion the way you learn to read a change in weather. It almost always meant something was wrong, even when he insisted nothing was. But love inside Joon-woo's world was never simply love. It was leverage waiting to be found by the wrong person. The rumors started small, the way they always did inside organizations like Cheonji. A comment, half joking, that the young heir's foreign girlfriend was asking odd questions. A suggestion dropped casually into conversation, that perhaps she wasn't as unconnected as she seemed, that perhaps a rival group or a journalist or someone with an agenda had placed her in his path deliberately. None of it was true. All of it was constructed to feel true, built from just enough real detail to survive a first glance. Amara began to notice things shifting around her that she couldn't explain. An assistant at her workshop who abruptly stopped showing up, spooked by a conversation no one would name. A landlord who raised her rent without warning, then dropped at the moment she threatened to leave, as if someone had simply wanted to test how she'd react under pressure. Calls that disconnected the second she picked up. A persistent Tae-sik had watched his nephew fall for a foreign woman with controlled, simmering alarm he never once let surface. It wasn't personal cruelty. He barely thought of Amara as a person at all. She was a variable, an unpredictable factor in a succession plan he'd spent a decade quietly shaping. A softened Joon-woo was a harder-to-manage Joon-woo, a less useful heir at exactly the moment Cheonji needed a disciplined one to survive an escalating dispute with the Baek family's network. A negotiated marriage to Baek Jun would end that dispute cleanly and cement Tae-sik's own position as the man who delivered peace. A foreign girlfriend with no political value threatened to derail all of it for nothing more than feelings. So Tae-sik made a decision, quietly and efficiently, the way he made every decision. He began the slow work of making sure Amara Whitfield disappeared from his nephew's life before she became permanent. It started with a warning delivered by a stranger, that continuing to see Joon-woo would put her in danger she couldn't imagine. Then a forged message slipped to her through a contact she trusted, suggesting Joon-woo had been seen with another woman. The right kind of woman, the kind his family actually wanted. Then a second, sharper warning, that if she cared about her own safety, she should leave Seoul and not look back, and that if she told Joon-woo any of it, the consequences would land on people she loved back home. Amara never learned, in those final terrified weeks, that the man delivering the threats answered to Tae-sik. She only knew her world had become unsafe in a way she couldn't explain to the one person who might have believed her, because every time she tried, Tae-sik intercepted the conversation first, smoothed it over, bought himself more time, and then she found out she was pregnant. She sat with it alone for 3 days, staring at her own hands, trying to imagine what kind of world she was about to bring a child into, one where she was being threatened by people she couldn't see, for reasons no one would explain, tied to a man whose family had never acknowledged her beyond a single icy question about whether she understood what they were. She decided to tell him. She really did. She had the conversation planned, word for word. For the evening, he came back from a business trip to Busan. She never got the chance. 2 nights before he returned, the final blow arrived, delivered in person by a man who showed her photographs, carefully doctored, of Joon-woo at a restaurant with Baek Jun, intimate and staged with weeks of precision behind it. The man told her, gently, the way you deliver bad news, that the marriage had already been arranged, that Joon-woo had known for months, that she had simply been a distraction before his real life began. None of it was true, but it was built from exactly enough real fear, real isolation, real exhaustion, that Amara, alone, pregnant, 7,000 miles from her family, believed it. She packed 2 bags in a single night. She left no note, because what was there to say to a man who had, in her mind, already chosen someone else while letting her be hunted in the shadows of a life he'd never fully shown her? She bought a one-way ticket home with money she'd been saving for a new press, and by the time the sun came up over Seoul, she was gone. Joon-woo came home from Busan to an empty workshop and a disconnected number. He searched for her with everything an empire like his could offer. Investigators, airport contacts, favors called in from people who owed him their lives. The trail went cold in Houston within a month, swallowed by a city of 2 million, and a woman determined never to be found by anyone connected to Seoul again. Tae-sik, watching his nephew's search with a desperation that unsettled even him, told Joon-woo exactly what he needed to hear. She got scared. It was too much for her. Deep down, she never really wanted this life. Joon-woo eventually stopped searching. Not because he stopped caring, but because there was nothing left to search for. He buried what he felt the only way he knew how, by becoming precisely the kind of man his father had raised him to be. Colder, sharper, untouchable. For 7 years, he told himself he had simply lost a woman who decided she didn't love him enough to stay. He had no idea he had lost a son, and he had absolutely no idea, standing frozen on a street in Itaewon with a fallen engagement ring at his feet, that the man who'd engineered all of it was still beside him every single day, trusted, smiling, waiting nervously to hear whether his nephew had finally seen something he was never supposed to see. Min-gyu picked the ring box up off the pavement, brushed it against his sleeve, and looked up to find the boss already 3 steps ahead. Cutting through the crowd with a focus Min-gyu had only ever seen him use right before dismantling someone in a negotiation. "Sir," he jogged to catch up. "Sir, the ring." "Keep it," Joon-woo said without turning. "Keep it where?" "Sir, this ring costs more than my apartment deposit. If I drop it, my mother will disown me before the insurance company even picks up." Joon-woo didn't answer. He'd stopped at the edge of a crosswalk, eyes fixed on the woman now steering the boy toward a side street, the two of them dissolving into the crowd the way a dream dissolves. Joon-woo finally turned to look at him, and Min-gyu, a man who genuinely feared very little, took an involuntary step back at whatever was sitting in his employer's face. "Here's my eyes." "Sir, lots of people have similar eyes. It's called genetics. I have my grandfather's ears, and he's not even blood related. He just married in, and apparently ears are contagious now, too." He watched Joon-woo's expression, not move an inch. "Sir, you have a fitting for your wedding suit in 40 minutes, and the Beck family specifically requested punctuality after last time. Cancel it." "Cancel this, sir." "Cancel everything tonight." Min-gyu stared at him for a long beat, then exhaled the long, theatrical sigh of a man who decided, roughly 3 years into this job, that arguing with Han Joon-woo when his face looked like that was about as productive as arguing with weather. "Fine, but when Director Young calls asking why the future groom skipped his own fitting, I'm telling him you saw a ghost. Because honestly, sir, that's what you look like right now. A very expensive ghost." By the time Joon-woo reached the side street, Amara and the boy were gone, swallowed into the evening the way Seoul swallows everyone eventually. He stood there breathing harder than the short walk should have caused, replaying the boy's face on a loop. The eyes, the unhurried, serious way the child had turned his head. Like nothing in the world was allowed to startle him. Joon-woo had looked exactly like that at 6 years old. In the one surviving photograph, his mother kept him standing stiff beside his father at some company event neither of them wanted to attend. He did the math without meaning to. 7 years since Amara vanished. A boy who looked 6, maybe 7. The numbers lined up with a precision that made his chest tighten. He spent the rest of that night doing something he hadn't done in years, something that would have alarmed his entire company if they'd known. He sent his security detail home, sat alone in the dark of his apartment with a glass of whiskey he never touched, and turned one thought over and over until it wore a groove in him. At 5 in the morning, he called Min-gyu and told him to find out, quietly, everything he could about a Nigerian-American, Nigerian and Texan. He corrected himself, woman named Amara Whitfield who had recently returned to Seoul. Quietly meaning, Min-gyu said, the kind where nobody at the company finds out, or the kind where only 15 people find out instead of 200? The first kind. That's going to be difficult, sir. Everything filters up to Director Han. Eventually, he has people everywhere. It's actually a little impressive, in a deeply unsettling way. Then make sure it doesn't filter up to him. Not yet. Not until I know what I'm dealing with. Min-gyu studied him for a long moment. You really think the boy is yours? I don't think anything yet. Joon-woo said, I need to know. What he didn't say, what he barely let himself think, even privately, was that some part of him had already decided, the second he saw that boy's eyes, that he was not marrying Baek Jun in 11 days. No matter what the answer turned out to be, Amara found out he'd seen them 3 days later, in the worst possible way. She was at her workshop on the edge of Yeonam-dong, a smaller, more worn version of the one she run 7 years earlier, when her friend Denise burst through the door, holding her phone like it was about to detonate. Denise had known Amara since their first overlapping year in Seoul. Two Black American women navigating a city that alternately welcomed and quietly excluded them. And she had a specific gift for saying exactly the wrong thing at exactly the wrong volume. Amara, you need to sit down. I'm already sitting. What is it? Malachi's after-school teacher called me because she couldn't reach you. She said a man came to the pickup gate asking about him by name. Amara's hands went still over the drying rack. What man? Tall, Korean, expensive suit. She said he didn't try to take him or anything. He just stood at the fence and watched for a minute, then left when security noticed him. Denise hesitated. Amara, she said when they told him to leave. He stood there a second longer, like he wasn't done looking. And then he said, and I'm quoting her exactly, tell his mother Joon-woo came by. Amara didn't remember leaving the workshop. She didn't remember the taxi. She remembered, with a clarity that scared her, standing at the school gate 20 minutes later, pulling Malachi into her arms, so hard he laughed and asked if she'd missed him that much. And she remembered thinking, with a kind of ancient, cold dread, he found us after 7 years. He'd actually found them. She had spent 7 years building a wall around herself and her son so high and so thick that she genuinely started to believe, in her better moments, that it would simply hold forever. She had a small life, a workshop, a small fierce family of 2, plus Denise, plus a handful of people in Seoul's expat circles who knew her only as a quiet, talented woman who worked with paper and never talked about Malachi's father. She'd told Malachi, when he was old enough to ask, that his father lived far away, that some adults made complicated choices, and she hated every word of it, because it wasn't even close to truth, and she didn't have the truth to give him, only the version of events that had driven her halfway across the world, pregnant and terrified. She had never told Joon-woo about Malachi, because by the time she understood she was carrying his child, she believed completely that he'd already chosen someone else, that the woman in those photographs was his future, and that the threats against her had been the price of standing in its way. She left to protect a child she hadn't met yet from a danger she believed Joon-woo himself had created, even if not with his own hands directly. Now he was standing at her son's school, saying his name to strangers, and Amara understood, with terrible clarity, that the wall had just cracked straight down the middle that night. After Malachi had fallen asleep clutching the stuffed elephant he'd had since infancy, Amara sat on the floor with Denise and a bottle of wine neither of them was actually drinking, and said the things she hadn't said aloud in 7 years. He's going to find out Malachi is his. Denise didn't ask if she was sure. She'd met Malachi. She'd seen the photos of Joon-woo that occasionally surfaced in Korean business coverage. The sharp-jawed, unreadable face of some conglomerate everyone whispered about, and no one explained clearly. Once you knew to look, the resemblance was impossible to miss. What are you going to do? Denise asked. I don't know. Run again, maybe. Amara, I know how that sounds. Amara wrapped her arms around her knees, looking smaller than Denise had seen her look in years. The last time I stayed and tried to fight for truth, I ended up alone, pregnant, 7,000 miles from my mother, hiding from people I never even saw coming. I'm not doing that to Malachi. I'm not putting him anywhere near that world. What if it wasn't what you think it was? Denise said carefully, what if the threats, the photos, what if none of it actually came from him? Amara was quiet for a long time. Then someone lied to me for months and ruined both our lives for no reason at all, she said finally. And I honestly don't know which version of that story scares me more. She did not run, whatever else Amara Whitfield was. She had never once in her life been the kind of woman who bolted the moment the ground started shaking. She stayed because Malachi had a life here, friends, a school he loved, a garden plot at the community center where he insisted, with total 7-year-old confidence, that his tomatoes were going to be the biggest in Seoul this year. She stayed and waited, because some stubborn, exhausted part of her knew with total certainty that Joon-woo would come find her properly. He came 4 days later, alone, no driver, no security, dressed in plain dark clothes instead of his usual tailoring, standing outside her workshop door at exactly the hour she closed for the evening. Amara saw him through the glass before he knocked. For one long moment, neither of them moved. He looked different than she remembered, older around the eyes in a way that had nothing to do with actual years. Still sharp, still controlled, but there was something underneath it now that hadn't been there 7 years ago. A kind of exhausted weariness she recognized instantly, because she carried the exact same thing in her own reflection every morning. She opened the door, because there was nothing else left to do. "You found us," she said. Her voice came out flatter and colder than she meant it to, but it held. "I saw him," Joon-woo said, "on the street, by accident. I wasn't looking for you." "And then you went looking for him? At his school?" "Yes. That's not by accident anymore, Joon-woo. That's a choice. I needed to know." "Know what?" He looked at her steadily, and for a moment all the careful distance either of them had built over 7 years simply evaporated, leaving two people standing in a doorway with the truth sitting enormous and unavoidable between them. "Is he mine?" Something broke loose in Amara's chest, grief and fury arriving at once, indistinguishable from each other. "Are you serious right now? You disappear for 7 years. You let me believe you'd already moved on before I even left the country. And now you show up asking if he's yours, like you have any right to an answer?" "I never moved on," Joon-woo said, and something in his voice cracked. The first crack Amara had heard in composure in 7 years. "I searched for you for months. I had nothing to find. You disappeared like you never existed. I disappeared because I was terrified. Men I never met threatened me. Joon-woo. Someone showed me photographs of you with June. Intimate photographs. Told me the marriage had already been arranged, that you'd known for months and let me believe otherwise. I was alone and pregnant, in a city 7,000 miles from my mother, and I had no one to trust, so I left." Joon-woo went very still. "What photographs?" "Don't," Amara said. "Don't act like you don't know." "I'm not acting like anything." His voice had dropped low, dangerous in a register Amara had never once heard directed at her. Only ever glimpsed at men who'd crossed him in business, back when she still occasionally saw that side of his world. "I have never been photographed with Beck, June, in any way that could be called intimate. Not 7 years ago. Not now. Whoever showed you that was lying, and I need to know who." Amara searched his face with performance she expected. The smooth, diplomatic deflection of a powerful man caught in an old lie. She didn't find it. What she found instead frightened her more than anything he could have said, because it looked exactly like the truth. "Someone inside my company fed you false information," Joon-woo said slowly, working through it as he spoke, like a man finally turning over a stone he should have turned over years ago. "Someone close enough to know my schedule, my movements. Close enough to fabricate photographs convincing enough to make you believe them. Someone who wanted you gone before I found out you were pregnant. Why would anyone want that? Because a foreign girlfriend was a liability to a marriage alliance already being arranged behind my back," Joon-woo said. His hand, without him seeming to notice, had begun its old unconscious motion. Slow circles against the inside of his opposite wrist. A son outside that alliance would have been an even bigger one. An heir who could complicate succession entirely. Someone wanted both problems gone, permanently, and they were patient enough to make it look like you'd simply left. Amara stared at him, feeling the wall she'd spent 7 years building groan under a weight it was never built to hold.